Hello everybody and welcome to this chapter about the accelerated Meran with 6 Queen c2. So this appears after the opening moves c4, c6, knight f3, d5, e3, knight f6, knight c3. Now our specific move for this course, the Chebanenko move a6, d4 and e6. So the starting point of the accelerated Meran. And in this chapter, we will have a look not at b3, which was the previous couple of chapters, but about Queen c2. And this move is, I would actually say it's one of the most solid moves for white. It was used, for instance, or most famously by Boris Gelfand in the match against Anand in 2012, which we have mentioned or referred to numerous times. It's a developing move, but also it's sort of a waiting move. Like the main point for white is to delay the development of the bishop on f1 in order to be able to recapture on c4 in one move. And also, without playing the move b3, we don't have this possibility of bishop b4, which we did in the against 6b3, because the knight on c3 is not weak at all. But our reply is quite an interesting one. Well, it's actually the main move theoretically, but in itself, it's an interesting move, I think. And it's the move c6, c5. And this might look to you quite strange, because why are we wasting first one move on a6 and then moving the c pawn a second time? But in general, actually, in these kind of positions, the queen on c2 is a little bit misplaced almost, or at least it weakens the pawn on d4, which makes it logical for us to try to attack it. And additionally, with this tension with the pawns on the d and c files, it's quite likely that the c file will be open. And once the c file is open, the queen will most probably have to move again, or at least it will be quite vulnerable. So actually, in the Slav in general, playing c6 followed by c5 a bit later on it's quite a common idea, especially against queen c2. So in the position actually with the queen back on d1, I mean, where black has played c5 in one move, the move a3 is quite common. It's actually one of the main lines. But here, the queen is actually even better on d1. Or I should say worse on c2 probably. And the reason is, as I mentioned, that the pawn on, with the pawns in the center most likely disappearing very soon, then the c file will be open and we will get a tempo on the queen. But when I had this position actually with white in 2010, so almost 15 years ago, against the Swedish Grandmaster Tiger Hillarp, I had never seen, I think, even the move a6 by that point. I was quite young. And when he then lost another tempo with c5, I thought, this must be too much. And I played actually a3 myself, thinking I have 2 extra tempi in the symmetrical position, so I must be doing great. But yeah, I was young and innocent back then. Now I understand that these 2 extra moves are not very relevant. So we take on c4. Again, we are actually keep insisting on our strategy of opening up the c file. It's true that this is a little bit rare with the bishop still on f1. Like we were waiting for the bishop to develop in order to win a tempo. But here it works quite well, because we are able to follow up if white takes with the bishop on c4 with b5 immediately, and we are getting quite a lot of space and a lot of tempi. So bishop a2, for instance, knight b d7, and now, well, or I should say actually this even before knight b d7, that this structure that has arisen now is more, I would say, reminiscent of the Queen's Gambit accepted, where black takes on c4. That's very typical. But it's, again, quite a decent version for us, because the move queen c2 is rather a waste. And the move a3, okay, the bishop is nice on a2, but it also takes quite a lot of time. So, in fact, we have a decent version, or even very good version. So knight b d7, short castle, bishop b7. The play is actually quite simple. We want to just develop the bishop, maybe to e7, but even preferably to d6 if given the chance. Castle short, and then simply these 2 bishops, one on d6, and especially the one on b7, they are very strong, putting a lot of pressure on white. So if white tries rook d1, in order to put some pressure on the against the queen. Then we play queen c7, and yeah, as you can see from the arrows, bishop e7 short castle or bishop d6 and short castle also possible. In any case, the thing with the position is that it's quite hard for white to get something going. Let's say like taking on c5 would not be very attractive. We would simply recapture, and then there is no logical follow-up for white. So what white actually would like to do, if possible, is to play e4 at some point. But as soon as white plays e4, we always take on d4, and with this bishop on d6, we have excellent control over this diagonal and especially over the e5 square. So yeah, it's very hard for white to get going, and additionally, there might even be some concrete problems with the e4 pawn. So if white's bishop was, let's say, outside the pawn chain, it would be a different matter. Then white could maybe try to go for some initiative. But here, such Queen's Gambit accepted positions, we are reaching from time to time, especially in the Accelerated Meran, but we're only reaching them in situations where we have a much better version than usual. So don't be afraid that you are not a Queen's Gambit accepted player. It will be fine anyway. So if we go back a couple of moves, instead of bishop takes c4, actually what I did against Tiger back in 2010, and also the most common move, was to take on c5 first. But it's all quite similar. Bishop takes c5, bishop takes c4. Here, only one trick to remember, that we should not play b5 too early, because white might consider taking it. And after bishop takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5, our king is under attack, but also the bishop on c5 is hanging. So a small trick useful to be aware of. But Tiger simply played knight bd7, so defending the bishop, preparing to play b5. And after bishop d3, I mean, there are a couple of different moves for white, but they don't really, I'd say they don't really matter very much, because our play is so simple. We castle, we play b5, we play bishop b7 against everything, and we have a very fine position. So yeah, as white, I tried the move bishop d3. Tiger castled first, which also makes a lot of sense. Short castle, and now b5. And if we get bishop b7, rook c8, we are actually already probably better. I mean, I'm a little bit hesitant to claim that we are better, but we are at least very, very comfortable. And I think very few players would prefer to be white. But if white tries something a little bit more concrete, which is what I did, knight e4, then there is one more move that I think it's useful for us to be aware of. And that is the move bishop to b7. So utilizing a small tactical idea that this bishop on d3 is hanging in the end. So for instance, knight takes c5, knight takes c5. And if white takes, then the bishop on d3 is hanging. White can take on h7 first, but then after queen takes c5, a very typical thing for these lines would happen. Bishop takes f3, g takes f3, and knight g5. And the point is that these two pieces are underdeveloped, way too far from the king. And especially with the double pawn, white is going to struggle. I think actually white is already very close to lost here, because the attack is simply too strong. So that's way too greedy for white. Instead, more normal would be to take on f6, which is also what I did. Knight takes f6. Now try to play e4. And here, the only thing that we should be aware of as black in these sort of Queen's Gambit accepted style positions is that white plays e5 and gets some sort of kingside attack. But I mean, all our pieces are too good. Our development is too nice for that to really be a concern. So here, Tiger played rook c8, preparing some discovered attack. So after queen e2, which was very logical, stepping out of the way, you can just play h6, which is actually also what Tiger did. And the point is that I mean, white can play e5, but as the queen does not have access to the e4 square anyway, I mean, our bishop controls it, we simply move the knight. And with so many pieces, well, I shouldn't say so many pieces, because it's only one set of knights. But it's enough, let's say, this knight. With another knight, let's say, just to explain, if there was a knight on c3 and a knight on d7, then after e5, our knight on f6 would struggle to find a good square. So now, whereas now, if white plays e5, then knight d7, and the queen doesn't have access to the e4 square, all our pieces are sensibly placed, and I don't think we can... we should be worried about getting under attack. So, and if we are not getting under attack, there is absolutely no grounds to complain, because then all our pieces are very nicely placed. So, yeah, a typical Queen's Gambit accepted style position, but one in which black has a very nice version. So, yeah, that's it about that line. About a3, which is actually very, very rare, but still important to mention. Another move that is played, is played from time to time instead of a3 is the capture immediately on c5. But that's very, very likely to transpose later on after bishop takes c5. Now, if a3 we take, it's already a direct transposition to what we just saw. And white can also take on d5. And after we recapture, it's another transposition to something that we will see very, very soon. So the best move and the most common move for white here is c takes d5. After which we take with the e-pawn. Again, as you saw in the previous couple of chapters in the Accelerated Meran, we are happy to accept the isolated d-pawn. This is quite similar in that sense. Here, though, we should note that in the previous line, the bishop was on d2, quite badly placed. Here, it might get to b2, which is a bit of a better square. So white can argue to have a better version. That's at least the argument for white. On the other hand, we did not waste time moving the bishop from first to b4 and then to d6. So we also, in some sense, have a better version. But yeah, one of the most solid ways for white to play is to take on c5, immediately settling us with the isolated pawn. We recapture with the bishop, and a very typical isolated queen's pawn position has arisen. Normally here white plays bishop e2, which is also a slight, perhaps, argument in white's favor, that in the previous chapter the bishop was already on d3, whereas on e2 it's a bit more solidly placed. Also the d file is open. Short castle, and here it's actually quite important what we do, because we have to anticipate white's ideas, because white has basically two ways to play. As we mentioned, this bishop should definitely be developed to b2, because that's much more active than d2. But there are two ways to do it. One is to play b3, bishop b2, very known, but the other way is to play a3, b4, and then bishop b2. And they are actually quite different, and we need to be ready for both. So what we do is we play the move bishop to e6. A natural developing move, yes, but the point is that if white now chooses to play the setup with a3 in order to play b4 next move, then instead of the most natural move knight c6, we actually place the knight on d7. And the point is, if white plays something like b4, we move the bishop, then we play rook c8, and the c file is first of all open, which it wouldn't be with the knight on c6, but also our knight can continue with knight b6 towards the c4 square, which has been weakened after a3, b4. And this is very, very nice for the knight, if we get it there. That's basically why against a3, we want the knight on d7, and against b3, we want the knight on c6, because then there is no reason not to place the knight on the most active square. The c4 square is anyway not available. So we want to be ready for both, depending on what white does, and therefore we start with the bishop in order not to commit the knight to the wrong square. If white is really, really tricky, white will play the move rook d1, and then the logic is exactly the same. White is still not decided between b3 and a3, so we still don't want to commit the knight. Therefore, we make another waiting move with queen e7. And the queen is quite useful on e7, especially here when the rook was on d1, creating some pressure. But sort of the main point is still that we develop according to what white does. So if a3, we still play knight b7, b4, bishop d6, bishop b2, rook a8. I mean, very, very normal, just as in the previous line. The knight gets to c4, which is a very, very nice square. And if white plays b3, then we immediately play knight c6, because then clearly the knight belongs there. So this flexibility with the knight on b8 is, I think, the only thing that you really need to be aware of in this specific line. It's quite important, but as long as you remember that detail, you will find all the rest of the moves, because they are very logical. So bishop b2, rook f d8, rook ac1, bishop a7. And this is a very, very typical setup for us. I have indicated some arrows. h6 always useful, getting some luft, preventing knight g5, but also rook should definitely go to c8. And our main plan in the long run is definitely to push d4. And the way that the white pieces are set up, it will actually be quite hard for white to prevent it in a good way. And white could try to move this knight, for instance, to a4. But that also allows knight e4, which can be quite risky for white, because then this bishop towards f2, maybe even some knight takes f2 sacrifice, for instance. So actually the most common scenario in this position is that we are able to break with d4, getting rid of our only weakness. And then it's a symmetrical position, but actually, generally speaking, black's pieces are a little bit more active than white. So it's definitely not like drawish or anything after that. It's very often that black is the one with a slight initiative. So there is one actually attempt for white here, which is a bit more concrete, let's say. And that is to play e4. Now we could trade everything on e4, which would be fine. But more interesting is actually to play knight c6, a bit of a tactical resource. And the point is, well, if white takes on d5, then knight b4, and we will be able to recapture on d5 on the next move. Importantly, in the end, the bishop on e2 will be hanging. So more critical for white is to play e5 to push the pawn. We move to d7 with the knight. And again, now white can't take on d5 at all, because knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, then knight b4, hitting both the rook and the queen, so losing material. But it looks like the pawn on e5 is a bit of an asset for white, I would say. Like it's usually a positive thing for white to get the pawn there. But here, actually, that's not quite the case. I mean, it's okay, but it's also double-edged, because we have some reasons for optimism as well, let's say. One is that this knight, as it can't go to, let's say, it will not be able to take on d5 for this tactical reason. It also cannot really join the king side. So with our pawn on d5, there is no knight e4, for instance. We'll just take it. And another reason is that we have very nice control over the d4 square. So we are controlling the square in front of the pawn, which means that our pawn might move forward later on. Not immediately, because it would actually allow knight e4, but at some point it will. And that's quite useful. So for instance, bishop g5. Now we simply move our queen. We don't want to play f6, as it would create a bit too many weaknesses. But we move our queen. Now the e5 pawn is starting to hang. So probably white should play bishop f4. Could have done it immediately, but actually the queen is a little bit worse on e8 than on e7. But after bishop f4, again, this typical little move h6, preventing knight g5. And it's hard for white to get going here. Like it's hard to come up with a clear plan, because the pawn on e5 is a little bit weak, something to take care of. And well, at some point later on, I said that immediately we don't want to play d4 because of knight e4, but later on it can definitely be a possibility. For instance, I will just show you how it can be prepared. So white has many moves, it's hard to predict what will happen, but let's say rook ac1. We play this typical prophylactic move, bishop a7. Just to remind you, again, this pawn never hanging, because we take and we have knight b4 with a fork. And if white makes another waiting move, let's say with bishop g3, Then with the bishop already on a7, and the pawn already on h6, which is actually also very important, we are ready to play d4. And the point is that after knight e4, we have the move bishop d5, after which the pawn on e5 is quite weak. So here, very important, white doesn't have knight g5. And if knight d6, the queen is actually very well placed on e6, again hitting the pawn on e5. And this pawn on d4 is very well protected by the knight and the bishop, and should not be underestimated. It can definitely be an asset for us in the future. I mean, after all, it's a passed pawn, and white does not have any passed pawn. So, yeah, a very typical way to proceed here for black, and also, yeah, the pawn on e5 is quite weak. So, don't really think that this is anything to be worried about, but useful to be aware of the move e4, definitely, and this knight trick with knight c6. If white is a little bit more of a theoretician, let's say, or a little bit more aggressive or ambitious, then the move bishop e2, keeping the tension, is the main try. And here there is a very important choice for black. And the choice is basically what to do about the central tension. And my recommendation is what I consider to be the most simple one, and that is to take on d4 with the pawn immediately. So releasing the tension, but importantly, we make sure that we see white's reaction, and then we can plan accordingly which structure white goes for. So if white goes for the symmetrical structure with e takes d4, then it's quite easy. We play knight c6, short castle. I mean, actually many moves here works. But I like bishop e6, simply developing. Next move, bishop e7, short castle. And again, white has this extra tempo with queen c2. But the queen is really not doing anything at all on c2. It would arguably still be better on d1 defending the pawn. So yeah, it's just a symmetrical position, which is completely fine. So bishop g5, for instance, bishop e7, rook a d1. Again, necessary in order to protect the pawn. Short castle, knight e5. And here, a very typical thing for these lines, which is good to know. When white plays knight e5, the most solid reaction, or the simplest reaction, is generally just to defend the knight with the rook, because we don't want to have to take to b takes c6, because then the pawn on a6 and the structure would be a bit weak. So we play rook c8 in order to recapture with the rook on c6. And that's basically it, because then white doesn't really have other ways to create pressure. We can flick in the move h6 at some point if we want, but also this queen b6 move, hitting the pawn on d4, also in some sense hitting the pawn on b2, makes a lot of sense. It's just a very equal position where we have absolutely no problems. White is, of course, also still fine, but there is quite a lot of play left, and yeah, nothing at all to complain about. So what white does, generally speaking, or what is much more interesting and ambitious, is the move knight takes d4. So now we have another situation with the isolated queen's pawn, which by now you should be quite used to and familiar with. And in this situation, actually, we show another point with our previous move to capture immediately on d4, because now we play the move bishop d6. And what I mean is that if we didn't capture immediately on d4, then at some point white would probably take, as we saw previously, and we would have to take with the bishop on c5. Whereas now, the bishop immediately goes to the sort of most ambitious diagonal, let's say, because now we are putting the bishop on the diagonal where we want to give mate later on. So remember, with the isolated pawn, in general, we are trying to go for the attack later on. And here it's an important question for white, because there is a very common move and there is a more ambitious and concrete one. And the most concrete move, which has been played, for instance, in a recent correspondence chess game, so a very high-level theoretical debate, is the move e4. And Well, it's a bit of a strange one, because I think from a theoretical point of view, what we did is a little bit rare to take on d4 so early and play bishop d6. But the only potential argument against it would be this move e4. Because in other, like against all other setups, we simply have a better version than the usual lines. So e4 in that sense is quite important. But on the other hand, it's quite a rare move in practical play, because if you are not prepared as white, it feels a bit odd to open up the center so quickly. And also after we capture on e4, white can't really recapture, because then after bishop b4 check, the knight on d4 is hanging. So at least that's not what white wants. So even beginning to think about e4 is a little bit requires, let's say, either theoretical knowledge or some good calculation skills, or some real creativity, let's say. So the automatic move would of course be castle, which we have a look at later. But after taking, white's idea is actually to play bishop g5. So quick development, and wants to bring a rook to d1 as quickly as possible. Short castle, we need to get the king into safety. And here in this recent correspondence game that I was talking about on high level, white played the most ambitious way with long castle. So in general, like generally speaking, of course, c-file is completely open. White does not have that many pawns in front of their king. But on the other hand, the development is quite largely in white's favor. I mean, just look at our pieces here. If they had already been developed, it would be suicide for white to castle long. But here it makes some sense, and we should be aware of it, actually. But I do believe that there is a very nice solution here, which is an important part of why I'm confident in recommending this system. Because here there is the move bishop to e5. Well, in itself, a very natural move, no doubt about that. But the point is, it looks like white is threatening a discovered attack. It looks like white can play knight e6, winning material. But then our big point comes that after knight to e6, we are able to simply take it with the point that after rook takes d8, rook takes d8. Yes, we sacrificed our queen, but actually we have excellent compensation for it. Again, it's connected to the weak white king. Also, a rook to c8 will come very soon with lots of pressure on the c-file. But also, first of all, the material investment. I mean, we do have one pawn, even though white can win it. But we still, and apart from that, we have one knight and the rook for the queen. So the material investment is somewhere like, if white recaptures the pawn, it's sort of 1 point, and without recapturing it, it's not actually a material investment at all. So, yeah, it's a very in any case, it's very modest, the material investment, and we have quite a lot of counterplay. Especially our king is much safer than white's king. Actually, our king is completely safe, whereas white's will come under fire. So, yeah, it's very easy to play also these sort of sacrifices, because our moves flows very naturally, and in the attack later on, we will have 2 attackers, and white will only have 1 defender, let's say, because we have 2 pieces and white has only 1, even though it's a better one. So, to me, humanly, I mean, this looks definitely preferable for black to play in practical play. The engines, of course, they are a little bit less convinced, or they don't think that black is better, at least. They think that it's completely unclear. But even completely unclear as black, I think is quite a nice deal. So white can try to win the pawn with bishop takes f6 and queen takes e4. But we calmly finish development. Again, this rook c8. And, well, it's 2 bishops. They are looking incredibly nice. The rook on the c-file, and white's king is very weak. So a computer is able to defend this and not be worse. But for a human, I think it's much easier to be black. So definitely nothing to be worried about. But it's very important to dare to sacrifice the queen in this way, because if not, then this position would be quite unpleasant for black. White would have a nice initiative with a fast development. So important to be aware of, but also importantly, nothing to fear at all. There is one more rare move, let's say, in this position, but it was played by the famous Jan Gustafsson, the German theoretician, also chessable author, also second of the world champion, and so on. Something to be taken seriously always, but it was played long ago and it didn't really seem like a deep preparation. It was the move knight to f5. So white is simply trying to pick up the bishop pair, but after bishop takes f5, queen takes f5. Yes, white has the bishop pair, but our development is quite fast and there is a lot of counterplay. So for instance, knight c6, short castle. I think the easiest is here simply to castle short as well. And yeah, as the arrows indicate, bring the rooks to the open file. Bishop on should probably go to e5 in this case, because here we are not so much trying to deliver mate. The reason is that white will be able to play g3 later on and just defend everything. The bishop on e2 can, worst case, also come to g2. So basically, without this light squared bishop from us, going for the kingside attack makes a lot less sense. But on the other hand, our central control is much better. And also this knight that white spent 3 moves getting to f5 and trade off is usually quite good on f3 because it prevents d4, keeps the pawn blocked, and also actually prevents bishop e5. So white is really missing that knight, which means that our bishop will be a powerful piece on e5, and I believe is a very comfortable equality. If we want to, we can also always just push d4 and trade the isolated pawn. So nothing at all to worry about, and it takes too much time for white to win this this bishop pair. So therefore, white normally castles. We castle as well, and here, actually here it's an interesting moment because white has a very natural move, but I think is quite dubious actually, because one very, very natural movement, I think, if not the most common, then one of the most common moves is rook d1, which looks natural enough, but actually we have our typical reaction. Actually, our next move, no matter what, is the move knight c6. Well, a natural developing move, but the point is that in general, white takes the knight on c6. So otherwise, we are able to take on d4 and go for the symmetrical structure. Or if the rook takes, the rook will come under attack as well. So generally speaking, what white does is taking on c6 as soon as the knight lands there. But after b takes c6, the rook on d1 is actually badly placed. Sounds a bit strange, but the point is that this pawn on d5 is very safely protected by its colleague on c6. So we are not really intending to play c5 here. We're intending to keep it on c6. And our plan is the usual with a kingside attack. So for instance, here, in most of the games actually that reached this position, white has played a very, very natural looking move b3. But it's actually a serious mistake for white. Sounds sounds a bit odd. White has only made natural things so far. But the point is that it's simply a little bit too slow. After rook e8, very natural move, activating the rook. Bishop b2. And here, it's possible actually to already go for the attack. We can play knight to g4. So it's a typical thing, especially with the hanging pawns. We also have seen similar things with the isolated pawn, but actually with the hanging pawns, it's even stronger because white has even less counterplay against the center. So here, again, as in the previous couple of chapters, the bishop, okay, it's better on b2 than on d2 for sure. But it's the, let's say, overarching theme is the same, that the bishop and the knight on c3 and the queen on c2, they are a bit too far away from the king side. So if we look at, let's say, the lefternmost 3 files of the board, the H, G, and F files, then white has no pieces there. Yes, we don't have either, but we have the bishop on its way to H2. We have the other bishop coming to h3, and we have the queen coming to g5 or h4. So we have a lot of attackers against the king, and white is actually struggling, because even if white gets a move, the knight still cannot reach the king side. The bishop still cannot reach the king side. Even the queen cannot really get there. So within the next couple of moves, we will have a lot of pieces on the king side, and the attack is simply very strong. So here actually black is almost winning, to be honest. And that's not even my feeling. Even the engines are agreeing now that white simply lacks defenders. So bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, with queen g5 or queen h4 next. I mean, the attack will basically play itself. Here we see another downside of the rook on f1, that white loses another move trying to save the rook. So this things have gone a bit wrong for white. And if white plays g3, well, it's a similar story. We play queen g5, then this typical move queen h6 in order to provoke further weaknesses. And if the h pawn starts to move, then everything is very, very loose. Then we can even begin to consider sacrifices on e3 and f2. So yeah, simply put, white lacks defenders, or enough defenders on the king side. So instead of that, instead of this move rook d1, a more natural move, or not a more natural move, but a better move order for white is to play b3 immediately, not wasting any time. Knight c6, same as in the previous line, takes, and bishop b2. And here white has one move faster on the queen side, but also importantly keeps one more defender sort of on the king side. We play the same move as in the previous line, rook e8, and here it's an important choice for white. So the rook fd1 would transpose, and it would of course be quite a bad move, because then our attack is already very strong. A slightly better move is rook c1. It also makes more sense, because actually the pawn on c6 is the weak one, not the one on d5. And after knight g4, white plays the move h3. And here we see another difference. The rook is actually defending the pawn on f2. So for instance, if we give this check, which I still think we should do, then after king h1, the pawn on f2 is now defended. So it's clear that the rook belongs on f1. But still, we have a nice way to follow up after the check. The point of the check is to trick the king to a worse square, and we'd retreat all the way. Another idea that we saw in the previous chapter, it's all sort of connected. Here, the idea is the same. We want to play queen d6, after which we want to give mate, of course. And white really doesn't want to push g3, because that would create a lot of weaknesses. So probably what white should do is take the knight on g4. Of course, not with the pawn, because then queen h4 would be mate on the next move. So take with the bishop. Bishop takes. And here, yeah, as the arrows indicate, we have a lot of attacking potential. We have two bishops. We have the queen very soon. And also the rook will come via e6 to h6. And again, there are simply not enough defenders for the white king. So here, white is a little bit faster. Also, the knight can be brought a little bit faster to the defense, but the attack is still very, very strong and ongoing. So definitely nothing to be worried about. Just remember this maneuver, bishop to b8, in order to get queen d6. That's a key maneuver. Another thing that is quite often done in these sort of positions is the move g3, which sort of, it voluntarily creates a weakness, but on the other hand, this diagonal d6 to h2, it's clearly the most dangerous one. So white at least prevents that. But after bishop to h3, rook fd1, knight g4, with the queen coming to g5, then either to h6, or this typical sacrifice will also be there. So it's definitely excellent counterplay for black. So what white should do, I think by far the best move for white here, is a move that I think over the board is not an easy move to make. It's the move knight to a4. And the point is simply to open up for the queen, to attack the pawn on c6, which is, I mean, it's possible for us to defend something like bishop d7, but then there are a couple of problems. One is knight c5 will come. Another is actually bishop takes f6, sorry. And once we recapture, then knight will come to b6, so hitting our bishop. So a couple of concrete problems. And if we got 2 moves, this move knight a4 would not really make any sense. But white has some concrete ideas. So here we actually need a clean solution. But luckily for us, there is a very nice solution. And that solution is to play knight to e4. So very similar to the previous chapters as well, that as soon as this knight leaves c3, we jump knight e4, because the square is no longer controlled. Also, it's a nice natural attacking move in general, intending queen h4 and so on. But of course, there is one big downside. White can and should take the pawn on c6. Hitting the rook on b8, on a8, sorry, but also importantly preventing us from playing queen g5 or queen h4, because then the other rook would be hanging. So we take our time, we calmly move the rook. We are intending bishop b7, hitting the queen, and after that we are ready to bring our own queen to the king side, I should say. So for instance, if white retreats voluntarily, then the bishop can go to f5 instead, creating some Röntgen attack against the queen. And after queen d1, we play the move rook e6, and the typical scenario. Actually, by now it's, to me, quite reminiscent of the Meran attempt chapter of the classical Slav, where we also give up this pawn on b7 in a slightly different way, but the play is very similar. We have the same nice kingside initiative. We have a lot of pieces there. White is somewhat lacking defenders, and even if there is no, let's say, immediate mate, I believe that the attack is very, very hard for white to deal with in the long run. So actually, white, I think, should be very, very precise here. Play rook d1 first, hitting the pawn. Queen takes d5 is now probably a threat. Of course, immediately queen takes d5, bishop takes h2 does not work. So rook d1, we play our bishop b7 move to force the queen back. Queen c2, rook c8, hitting the queen again. And also importantly, preparing to bring the rook over. Not only this rook can go to the king side, but actually the other rook via c6 can come as well, as we will soon see. And now for white, it looks like the queen has 2 reasonable squares, but there is only one move that works. And that move is not queen b1, because after queen b1, our idea of queen bishop takes h2 immediately just works. King takes h2, queen h4 check, king g1, sorry, and rook c6. And suddenly, we very, very clearly see what this knight, it should have been on f3, and this bishop should have been somewhere closer to the king side as well, because now we simply play rook h6 next, and there is no defense against the mates. So white is just completely lost. Even rook g6 is very strong with an attack on the g2 pawn. So yeah, white has to be very careful. White actually has to play queen to d3, takes on h2, queen h4. What is the difference, you might ask, after rook c6? Well, the difference is that white has this move queen d4. So attacking the pawn on g7, and we are not in time for rook h6. So instead we have to play rook g6. We are still going for it, by the way, because we still have a very strong attack. So rook g6, and here we want to play, for instance, queen h3, followed by a mating attack. If white plays bishop f3, which is the most natural developing move, defending move, then we have a very nice tactical idea, actually. And that is to play knight to g5, hitting the bishop. And the point is, after queen takes h4, the knight takes f3, hits both the king and the queen. And we win back the material. We have won a pawn in the process. g2 is still hanging, so we definitely have a very nice ending here. So actually what white can do here is to play knight to c5. And this actually comes with a very cunning tactical finesse. Because if we now play queen h3, which looked very natural, then white has a stunning resource that saves the day, and that is queen takes g7 check. Rook takes g7, bishop takes g7, and white has sacrificed their queen, but now our queen is hanging, and if our queen moves, then the knight can eliminate our dangerous attacker, and on the next move white retreats the bishop from g7, and materially speaking white is having enough for the queen, and also strategically speaking or positionally speaking all white's pieces are now decent, and importantly the king is no longer under an attack, so our main plan has sort of failed. So although this is not so clear, we should definitely not allow it, I think. And after knight c5 we actually can continue with a couple of different moves, but it will all in the end I think come down to the same thing, and that is the sacrifice rook takes g2 either now or on the next couple of moves, with the point after king takes g2, queen g5 check. White will not be able to escape the checks, king h2, queen h4, and yeah, with an immediate draw. So the line ends in a draw here, but it did require some quite good defensive maneuvers or ideas for white. So I don't think, again, we should complain about a nice draw with black if white is very precise. This also concludes the lines in this chapter. I just want to go through one of the most, the most important things. I think one is that we are going for this knight c6 move, allowing this double pawns, and in this, or hanging pawns I should say, and with these hanging pawns we do have quite a nice initiative with this knight g4, queen g5, queen h4 and so on, many attackers, white lacks defenders. And I think the other main thing in this line is actually this concept in this position that white has this setup with a3, b4 or b3, and we have to be ready for both, and therefore we do play this waiting move bishop e6, and if rook d1 the other waiting move queen e7. So if a3 we develop the knight to d7, and if b3 we develop the knight to c6. So very important to keep flexible. But that I think is more or less the two most important things of this chapter. This concludes the theoretical section of the chapter with queen c2. Just to remind you of the most important ideas and the bullet points, we do play c5, very, very natural move as soon as the queen has left d1, because d4 is weak and the queen will likely get under threat on the c file when the c file opens up. C takes d5, e takes d5. Now, the first important thing to remember, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, bishop e2, castle, castle. We do have to be ready for both a3 and b3, which I explained. So we do play the waiting move bishop e6, and if a3, we do play knight bd7, keeping the c file open. If b4, the knight can come to c4 later on. So very important to have the knight on d7 if a3. And if white plays b3, as we discussed, then a3 will be a bit too slow, so we can take the chance to play knight to c6, the most active square. And from here on, it's quite easy. We just develop our queen, bring the rooks to the center, at some point push d4, and we have no problems whatsoever. But very, very important to keep flexible with knight on b8. Furthermore, if white played bishop e2, we did take on d4, and that's quite important because we want to trick white's knight away from the better square on f3. That means also that white's king side is slightly weaker. And now our general idea is to create an attack on the king side later on. So bishop d6, short castle, short castle. White will most likely play something like b3. And we always accept the hanging pawn structure with knight c6, let white take, and after we recapture, we do have quite a lot of play against the white king. That is definitely our main idea. Knight g4 is one move, opening up for the queen to h4, trying to provoke a weakness. Should white play h3, then again drop back the bishop to c7, try to get queen d6. This battery will create quite dangerous threats, and we can very easily drum up excellent play against the white king. So two of the most important ideas that we saw in the chapter. It concludes the entire chapter. I hope you have enjoyed. I hope you look forward to trying it out yourself. And I am looking forward to see you in the next chapter. Thank you very much.